So, okay, have we agreed to disagree, or what do we disagree? I mean, yeah, I guess we do disagree about emphasis. Do we disagree about emphasis?
We
Uh,
disagree about cause and effect to some degree, I think, and we disagree about how much it's a vestige, how much systemic racism is a vestige versus a an ongoing, baked in part of current American systems.
Now, what about my allegations early on that there's failure in the midst of African American life here, that there are too many broken families, there's too much indiscipline, you're thinking people are simply succumbing to their circumstances. What can they do? I'm thinking, no, we have to, not only at the individual level, but at the communal level, to take responsibility and embrace the possibility of control, of overcoming, of resisting. Do we really have to live with what we're seeing in Chicago and St. Louis and Baltimore and whatnot, in terms of homicide rates and so on, and carjacking and assault? And, I mean, and what about the politics of this? Eric Adams, isn't that the guy's name, who's getting ready to get elected mayor? This is a former cop in the era of Black Lives Matter. The Soros funded, I'm sorry for the cliche, but it is Soros funded. These justice DAs all around the country are the Cori Bush types of St. Louis, and the Larry Krasners of Philadelphia, and don't they have one in San Francisco? And we get, are they going to carry the day here? Or when you let somebody out because you don't believe in pretrial detention and you think that minor property offenses oughtn't to be enforced, and I'm certainly not going to have cops spending time bringing me cases of somebody with marijuana. Is the jury in now on whether the consequences of that kind of institutionalization of your cast of mind, if I may say so, is going to work on the streets, and whether people are going to be able to live with the consequences of it? A, is the uptick in crime in any way related to the justice warriors, Black Lives Matter, reformist, whatever? And B, are the people going to stand for it?
Okay, so this goes back to what you were talking about before when you were talking about the equities and kind of the changing face of the criminal justice system. And I will say my sort of bottom line about this is that you're right. It is the institutionalization of views like mine, which I never thought in my life that I would see, because when I started practicing law in Los Angeles in federal court in the year 2001, if you had told me a public defender with incarcerated parents is going to run and win for DA in San Francisco, I would have told you that you were out of your mind. If you had told me that he was going to be one of 10 or 15 that was going to be in power in cities that have hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people, and implementing policies that were basically pipe dreams, I would have told you that you are out of your mind. And here we are today, and that's the case. So then the question is, what's the result of all of this? Now, I think the jury is out, because these guys haven't, and women, they haven't been in power long enough for us to really see. We had, I think the canary in the coal mine is really Larry Krasner in Philadelphia, because he was kind of the first one to run and win from a public defender civil rights background. And he just got reelected, at least in the Democratic primary, which in Philadelphia, that's the whole race. And he pounded his tough on crime opponent. So that does suggest some kind of a staying power for progressive prosecutors, even though violent crime is up in Philadelphia. And there's a lot of outcry about that. So I think we're going to see when all these other folks come up and they're seeking second terms, what happens to them. I guess your question is, well, what's going to happen when we release people, or what is happening now when we're letting people out on bail much more often? And, that's a complicated discussion. But one thing that we were doing, which I think was completely not just wrong sort of morally, but didn't make any sense, is that we were criminalizing poverty. We were saying, okay, you're going to take two people and they're going to commit the same crime, and we're going to put an amount on it. So if it's a charge of armed robbery, you need to pay $30,000 to get out. It's the exact same crime. Well, the rich robber is going to pay and get out and be dangerous and be on the streets, and the poor robber is going to be inside. Never mind, of course, the presumption of innocence. And lots of times people who are charged, they can't prove it, they didn't do it, et cetera. And so this whole idea of monetizing freedom, to me, never made any sense. It does not address the ultimate question, which is this person dangerous? You're just putting a price that some people can pay and some people can't. That doesn't make any sense. And I think that cash bail was a bloated industry that basically propped up these bail institutions that were shaking people down, taking percentages, not giving it back, et cetera. So, and not really doing anything to address safety. So I think bail is a problem. Then your question is, well, if we're releasing all these people, are we going to see upticks in crime, right? And I feel like, again, these bail reform laws haven't been in effect long enough, certainly not in California, where our Supreme Court just basically did away with that whole system and said, you've got to do something different for us to really know. But it's hard for me to believe that locking up people for nonviolent offenses like drug crimes and loitering and things of that nature, that when you let them out, violent crime is going to soar. But then you make this other point, which is, look at what just happened in New York City, because we had all these people running on a progressive platform. They lost to a former cop. And what do we make about that? And is that a turning point? And why is it that New Yorkers' number one concern was crime? Why? And I find that to be a very vexing question, because when you look at the crime statistics over time, and I mean, starting from the 90s, the spikes that we saw in the 90s, we are not seeing those spikes now. The rise that we are seeing, the uptick that we are seeing is relatively mild, is relatively gradated versus these huge spikes in the 1990s. And yet in the public mind, they're basically the same. And a lot of ways that the media covers it is basically the same and kind of contributes to this panic that the crime is completely out of control. But when you look at the actual numbers, they're very small. So for example, in New York in the 1990s, I think at one point, there were almost 2,500 murders that year. This past year, there've been 450. That's more than the 200 and something the year before. But you can see how statistically, it's nowhere near the spikes that we were seeing. So then you have to ask yourself, well, to what degree is the media contributing to this? To what degree are the people who are now out of power, the tough on crimers, seizing on this to try to get back in power and reinstitute their old policies, which I feel like you and I can probably agree, at least to some extent, were a failure?
Well, I should probably know the crime statistics better than I do. I know people who know them, and I think they would disagree with your assessment of the both impact of, for example, eliminating pretrial detention and also of the year-to-year changes here. I agree that they're not what we saw in the 90s. No, how could they have been? What was the homicide rate in New York? One of those, over 2,000 in a year, something like that. And it's under, what is it, under 300 or 400?
Correct.
So no, we this is not the 1990s by any means. Who knows where it will go? I don't, it's early on in the uptick, but my understanding is that homicide in big cities is up like 30% on average over the year before. And my understanding is that the changes that are going on, including changes in people's in policing and behavior of police, the so-called Ferguson effect. I know it's so very, very controversial. My former student and someone whom I admire, Roland Fryer, the economist, has got some data on basically, arguing that police departments that are under scrutiny are the behavior of police officers in terms of stops and the aggressiveness of their engagement is going down, and that is associated causally with increases in crime. I wish that I could cite chapter and verse. I want to just register a objection here to your quantitative characterization of the thing. But I think at the end of the day, it comes down, I accept your arguments, the theoretical arguments about the inequity of cash bail. People haven't been convicted, and moreover, those with the cash are the only ones who are going to be able to avail themselves of the option of being out of jail during the pretrial period. That there's something that seems unjust about that. I grant that. Although I think that if I have a large number of people who are offending, some of whom are getting apprehended, some of whom are apprehended are innocent, some of whom are guilty, we could say what those numbers are. I'm thinking 95%, 5%, but we could argue about those numbers. And I know I'm going to have recidivism in this population amongst those who are offending. It seems hard to avoid, just as a matter of arithmetic, the consequence that if I don't keep people who have been apprehended, which is some indicator of the likelihood that they have offended before trial, the fact of letting them out will also let out some people who actually are offenders and who are going to reoffend in the period during which they otherwise would have been confined. That feels to me like that's necessary. It may be an unfortunate necessity that one has to take as the unavoidable consequence of ensuring that individuals are treating justly. But I don't see why you need to deny that someone who is who is apprehended and charged with a gun crime and who is then released. And if I'm doing this as a matter of ordinary course of business, that the consequence of that will be some enhancement of the frequency with which gun crimes are committed against people, because offenders are going to be have more time, to offend.